There we go. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, as Jack said, I am the art curator at the RHS Lindley Library, and also just started the PhD with Queen Mary's. So, the collection I'm going to talk to you about is a collection I've worked with for quite a long time. But what I'm looking at now is the network of how these paintings sit within a much broader collection of other paintings as well. So the title of my talk is Language of Flowers, an Alternative Perspective. So deliberately kind of taking that traditional Victorian view of the language of flowers and looking more at history of plant names in botanical paintings and how they've both been a tool for communication, but also I think potentially cultural obfuscation. So hopefully I can give you some examples to give you a sense of what it is I'm talking about. So specifically, my research is on the RHS Reeves collection, and I will show you some pictures shortly, and the Chinese names that are recorded in these artworks. So this is just to give you a slightly better sense of kind of how this fits into my wider PhD project. So I'm looking at the RHS Reeves collection as my principal point to identify, document and interpret a network of copy pictures where we have pictures in common or versions of the same pictures repeated that are held in museums, libraries and archives across Europe and the US. I have hunted for pictures in Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Macau, that are paintings that are particularly works in common with this collection, not yet found any. However, if you recognise any, then I'm very happy to be corrected on this. So taking a much broader view for the PhD, looking at art history, material culture and cultural histories, and then on the other side, the botany, the plant histories and taxonomy. At a point of intersection, we have inscriptions and plant names. Inevitably, of course, we also need to consider the artists, collectors, patrons, collaborators and horticulturalists. But for the time being, I'm just focusing on the inscriptions and the plant names. So just to give you a sense of actually what this collection looks like, so you don't think that it's all just going to be about the words today. So the RHS Reeves collection is, depending on how you count it, roughly 800 paintings of plants. Dating to between 1817 and 1831, John Reeves was a tea inspector for the East India Company based out in Canton, Guangzhou now, and Macau. And he was working to send specimens of plants, dried herbarium specimens, and paintings back to the Horticultural Society of London, as we were previously known. So this 13-year period during which Reeves was sending back paintings is quite significant because we have quite close dates for a number of these artworks. And for a long time, this collection has sat at the heart of the work of the RHS, and particularly what we were doing in the 19th century in order to try and promote and bring through new garden plants for a burgeoning middle class and sort of fairly wealthy leisured class in gardens and the plants that they were keen to see. But also alongside of that, Reeves was corresponding with Joseph Banks, and it was actually through Banks that he started to collect plants and paintings, but also with the directors at Kew as well. So he sits at the heart of this network that John was just referring to. So what we have here is a large number of paintings that for a certain amount of time we thought were unique. The documentation in the RHS collection suggests they were commissioned and collected and painted for Reeves by the most talented artists of the region. So they were very much celebrated and very important in terms of early plant identification, both in terms of plants that hadn't been seen before in England, or plants that had been sent over, had survived the journey, but then took several years to come to bloom and to be suitable for propagation. So actually served as quite an important form of evidence. So to frame my talk today, I've got three quotes here that I think are quite useful in terms of the consideration for how we look at the language and the understanding of the documentation that is evident in the paintings. So Robert Morrison was working with John Reeves. He was a reverend and also a surgeon who was, for a period, employed by the East India Company. And he wrote an important dictionary of the Chinese language published in 1815. And he says that anything in Chinese beyond commonplace topics of colloquial intercourse is quite unintelligible when expressed in letters of the Roman alphabet. So here he's talking about the transliteration that we see that quite often goes alongside the Chinese characters that indicate the local common names or the local dialect names, and saying that actually just having a romanization of these is not of really any particular use if you don't also have the Chinese characters as well. Slightly later in the 19th century, Emil Pritchardner, in 1881, wrote that in order that science, Western science, may profit from a study of Chinese botanical works, it is necessary not only to understand the Chinese written characters, but also recognize the plants described to ascertain their scientific names. So again, here he's kind of talking about the fact that we need to kind of have an understanding from a Chinese point of view as well as a Western point of view. And then I think my final quote by Nicholas K. Menzies, his book was just published this year and it really kind of helps to frame what I'm trying to do here. Is to say that by insisting on the distance between the two worlds of modern botanical science and traditional knowledge is less enlightening than to look for the intersections between them or to explore the pathways that lead from one to the other. So that's really what I'm trying to do here. So to just give you a sense of what these other collections are, where they are, and a little bit about how these networks fit together. There are a number of collections that I already know about where we have images in common and we know there were relationships between the collectors and the patrons. So these are with the Duncan album at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, the Kerr collection at Kew, collections that I look after at the Royal Horticultural Society, but also the sister collection of Reeves paintings at the Natural History Museum. So those are definite specific relationships that can be mapped and can be documented. In addition to this, there are also collections that have come to light in the last year, also at the Bibliothèque de l'Institut in Paris with the Benjamin Delasay album, an album of paintings at the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, and also an album known as the Reeves Paintings at Oak Spring in Virginia. I know there are also a lot of other collections in the US and hoping to do some more exploration as my time goes on. And then just by way of acknowledgement, but also a little bit of a disclaimer, I'm not a sinologist and I'm also not a botanist. So I do have to lean quite heavily on the support of other people. The original translations for the RHS Reeves collection took place in 2014 with the help of Andrew Lowe, Francis Wood, Si-Chiang Wang, and Kate Bailey. So I'm very dependent on the work that they did in order to help with the analysis. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about copy images or images in common. So these are examples of peonies. So the Reeves album in Oak Spring, the Kerr collection at Kew, a painting that we have at the RHS, copied by a British artist, Sarah Ann Francillon, the RHS Reeves painting here, the Oak Spring, and then another painting in common in an album known as Flora Japonica. So there we've got another level of confusion as to whether or not we're talking about Japanese or Chinese artworks. So the picture that I think is particularly interesting here is this copy made by Sarah Ann Francillon in 1821 that was a deliberate copy from one of the East India paintings because it was one that we felt, the RHS felt, was important to have a copy of. So slightly later than the artworks that we know were being painted by on behalf of Kerr and by the artist that Reeves was employing as well. So an interesting point of copying and reissuing outside of the realm of the Chinese artists. So what I just want to draw your attention to briefly is what we look at when we are reading botanical art and botanical illustration. So particularly with the Reeves paintings, we look at conventions in botanical illustration, stylistic elements that speak of traditional Chinese flower painting. We have undertaken some analysis previously on the pigments, materials, papers, and particularly the observation of graphite pencil. And now looking at the text, inscriptions, and then numbers and stamps that occur as well. So first set of paintings to draw your attention to is the Red-Hearted Plum. Now this is quite an unusual painting. It is quite traditional in many ways in terms of a piece of botanical art or illustration. We have the cross-section of the fruit with the seed detail. We have the flowers as they're emerging from bud to full bloom. We have the small unripe plum as well as the clusters of plum, how they grow on the branch together, and dissections and magnifications. The translation of the Chinese characters here is given to us in a modern Pinyin. So we've got two methods of transliteration, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. But bearing in mind the dates of these pictures predates the standardized Pinyin. So often what we find with a transliteration is it's a phonetic guide or a phonetic aid to the pronunciation of the plant names. And this is a painting that drew my attention when I saw the album in the Fitzwilliam, because it's a redrawing of the Reeves Dark-Hearted Plum. Here we have the Chinese characters written from right to left rather than top to bottom as we saw with the first picture. And we do also have a transliteration. So here the phonetic spelling of the sounds for pronunciation. And I'm just going to show you now the next slide with a comparison of the two pictures side by side so you can see where the similarities and differences lie. So obviously it's the blossom detail has been redrawn and repositioned. The dissections here, whilst they're all still present, are presented in quite a different way, as well as the characters themselves. So as I mentioned, we have from right to left with the Fitzwilliam drawing and from top to bottom, but the characters are still there and they are still in the correct order, bearing in mind the translation of the plant name. Another set of pictures that are also really quite interesting are these large citrus, so pomelo, with pink flesh. And these, I think, are really very distinctive. They look really quite traditional in the fact that then they're very large fruit, and the treatment for the detail here is not something we typically see in Western botanical art or illustration. However, the conventions are still present in that we have the blossom, we have the bud detail, the fruit as it hangs on the branch, and the skin as well. So the translation for this particular variety is the Dou Yu. Forgive me if I've got that incorrectly, but it translates as a grain measure pomelo, so referencing the fact that it's as large and as heavy as a measure of grain. So a cultural reference here in the plant name. The Latin name, the current Latin name is Citrus maxima, synonyms being Citrus grandis. So both refer to the size and the weight, but obviously we lose something about the cultural reference there in the current Latin name. Here I've given you a detail of the character for the plant name. This is the redrawing of this particular picture from the Cambridge collection. And here the transliteration, again, phonetic, it's Zaoyu, so similar sounds, but not necessarily written in the same way. And then we have another picture here, possibly from what is thought to be the Kerr collection, but part of the RHS collection. These were donated to us about 5 years ago. So similar treatment in terms of the style of the illustration, but obviously another redrawing. And we have the Chinese plant name, much, much smaller, much less prominent, and without any form of transliteration. And then finally, from the Delasset album in Paris, we have another redrawing. Some elements of the leaves and the shape of the stems are quite similar, but it is definitely a unique drawing in its own right. And again, we don't have a plant name here and we don't have a transliteration. I thought it might be quite interesting at this point just to give you the definition of the Citrus maxima as it appears in the flora of China, just to kind of reiterate the point around botanical illustration and why it's important as a tool for identification. So here I've highlighted the words in green, so the winged leaves, we've seen those, we've seen that we have thick, long styles, a pale yellow or greenish globulose fruit that is about 10 centimeters in diameter, large prominent oil dots, and reddish pink segments, fruit segments, and irregularly shaped seeds. So all of that written information is condensed into our visual reference for the botanical illustration. Another example that I wanted to draw your attention to is the Annona squamosa. So this is one from the Reeves collection, and we have the Chinese characters here. Transliteration is for the foreign or barbarian lychee, as it was introduced from North America by the Dutch. So here we have a reference to the plant not being a native one. But the lychees are now very much associated with fruits from southern China and were very popular in terms of what explorers were interested in finding out more about and the correspondence between the Chinese, the naturalists, and those based in London as well. So here we have a redrawing of this picture in the Kerr, what is possibly another Kerr picture at the RHS. And again, this very, very small characters, almost insignificant. They're not really featured as a significant part of the illustration. And here again with the Fitzwilliam illustration, we've got a transliteration again, slightly different phonetic sound, but written to convey the same information on the pronunciation. And then finally, I want to talk about the citrus, because this is where we see further evidence when we look at the RHS Reeves collection in combination with the Natural History Museum. So here the text takes a much more prominent position. We have a transliteration along the side, and then down at the bottom we have the beginning of a first attempt at creating a Latin name or a Western identification. So here this is known as the orange small variety mandarin, and the transliteration is Chu Sha Cat. Down at the bottom, it's very, very difficult to read, but there is an inscription number, and that is cut off down at the bottom. There's an HS to designate that it's part of the Horticultural Society collection, and a number, but the number, unfortunately, was trimmed, so I could only read that it had a 7 at the beginning. But when I looked at the Natural History Museum collection, we find that the text is almost in the same place, but without the transliteration. We have a more recent rendering of the name. So again, it's a small mandarin. But pleasingly, we have the stamp marked intact. So I know that this is number 78, which is significant for when I looked at another picture, because here you'll notice that this is a much fuller composition. We have the cross section as well as the full fruit. So on this illustration, much closer to botanical art in terms of it being a portrait format rather than a landscape format, as we saw with the other fruits, but we didn't have that cross-section and that fruit detail, whereas on this one we did. So this, when read in tandem with another picture in the RHS collection, fills in the gaps. Here we have the inscription in Reeves's handwriting, add to HS 78. So this also, for the first time, gives me an indication of the chronology of these pictures, indicating the RHS painting came first, and then the Natural History Museum collection that Reeves held as his own personal collection came second. So he's using these in tandem as a means of keeping track of his plant specimens and his illustrations. And then finally, this citrus is particularly interesting because we've got two variations on a plant name with transliteration. The common name for this particular variety of citrus is now known as the Buddha's hand. But during the 19th century, the two common names given were either that it was the fragrant citrus, fragrant yuan, or that it was a fingered citron. So it looks like a bunch of hands or a bunch of fingers. But what we don't have right in the early days is reference to the Buddha, and I'm not sure why. I'm not sure whether this was just something that was missed out or whether there was actually a deliberate refusal to record what was seen as local religious practices and rites. So that requires a little bit more investigation on my part. And then what is particularly lovely here with these two illustrations of chrysanthemums is that it gives, I think, quite a good example of why it's important to keep these records intact. So make sure that we keep the Chinese characters in our documentation and that we keep a translation and a transliteration as well. So what's particularly lovely is that the right-hand pink, quilled pink, is known as the purple dragon whiskers. And on the left-hand side, the white chrysanthemum is Lao Tzu's eyebrows. So these are obviously quite strong cultural references and require a little bit of additional investigation to find out more about their relevance. And it's a real shame that in our translation as given for the beginnings of a local Latin name, all of this information is missed. So all we have is that it's a pink quilled chrysanthemum or that it's a white chrysanthemum. So all of that additional information has been lost, which I think is a real shame. Here, this is the version of the Natural History Museum picture, again with the Chinese characters, the names of the plants, but sadly not a transliteration or a translation present on them. So why is it important, but also why is it difficult? Because I recognise as being a curator and also working with other curators, there's a reason that this information has maybe not always been captured. Sometimes it might be down to institutional focus and lack of resources. Certainly a number of these artworks sit within horticultural or botanical institutions where the primary focus has been on Latin plant names. And it's really only in the last 10 years or so that an interest in trying to translate and include this additional information has come to the fore, and that the networks with academics and researchers has enabled us to be able to make use of cultural reference information as well as the Chinese characters as well. When we read these characters, obviously the inscriptions are quite different. They're made by different hands. The transliteration is pre-standardized Pinyin. And we also have changes in plant names and plant taxonomy to deal with as well. Quite often there are uncertain interpretations. And so what we want to try and do is make sure that we work with the right people to make sure we capture the right information and we don't add another level of obfuscation there. And finally, the assumptions we can't make is a chronology We don't know who necessarily wrote all of this information. There's further work to be done on that. And we don't necessarily know who the interlocutors were, who was offering the Chinese plant names, who was then documenting them, and who was reading them. But all of this, I think, is going to keep me preoccupied for the next few years as I try and work out some of these connections. And actually, in a landscape where we don't necessarily know who the artists were, what we can do is record and make available as much information as possible about these paintings to bring to the fore some of those unknown characters that have played significant roles in helping with informing our knowledge. So that was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through my work. So thank you very much, and happy to take questions shortly.